The CIA was already supplying Afghanistan's Mujahideen with arms and money under Carter. But under William Casey, the agency overarms dozens of guerrilla groups over which it has no control, even supplying them with high-tech weapons so they can attack the Soviets. Anti-aircraft missiles are put in the hands of Islamist fanatics in return for a vague promise they will only be used against Russia. 10 years after the Soviets left, the weapons are still in circulation.
$1 billion a year at the end, a total of maybe $3 billion for the Afghan effort. You know how much the Cold War cost the American taxpayer? $13 trillion. There's not even I don't even know how many zeros that is. And $3 billion to finish it off was a good buy. It's a bargain.
That was a success. The fact that you created a group of people who were armed led to other problems.
In fact, the United States CIA supplied the Afghan Mujahideen with weapons, with instructions, and as we know, Bin Laden was one of the recipients at the time.
The most fundamentalist groups at that time are the ones that we now face, or their descendants, if you will, are the ones that we face.
We did provide some arms to the Afghan Mujahideen, and some of those turned around and are now fighting against us. That's true.
This is an example of blowback, of unintended consequences. The agency took actions to help bleed the Soviet Union, and it helped bring down the Soviet Union. But they did not understand that the people they were helping were not fighting just the Soviet Union.
We shouldn't have had so many illusions about who our friends were in that campaign against the Soviets in Afghanistan.
We didn't choose our allies very well. We didn't exercise very much control over them. And then after we had accomplished the purpose of bleeding the Soviet Union, we did not continue to be engaged with those people. We closed down the shop.
The world then, after 1989, turned its back on Afghanistan. Not CIA. CIA doesn't build nations. CIA does its thing.
We thought we thought the American government should continue to provide support to the Afghans after '89, and essentially the United States walked away from Afghanistan.
And let Afghanistan become something new, a failed state. And that's not a good thing.
Maybe they didn't need quite so many arms, the Stinger missiles. Maybe they didn't need that much support. And did we create the Islamist movement?
It was a foolhardy and stupid policy that almost destroyed Afghanistan, and the blowback, the effect of all of that is being felt now around the world with this war on terrorism. I mean, we have to look at our own complicity in creating the conditions that allowed a lunatic like Osama bin Laden to succeed in appealing to people who have no hope.
The Soviets are dragged into the mad race to overarm the country. 10 years of bitter fighting bleed Russia dry. Throughout the Reagan presidency, the CIA's Robert Gates issues highly exaggerated assessments of Soviet power, rendering the White House totally unable to predict the fall of the Soviet Union.
As the casualties increased and the difficulties of the war grew, it had the same kind of impact inside the Soviet Union that Vietnam had in the United States. And it contributed, I think, significantly, ultimately, to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
And it was very clear that the Soviet Union could not sustain the military budget and the other expenses associated with its overseas adventures that it had been doing.
They couldn't afford it. It was a house of cards. It was a financial house of cards. They could not afford the extension, as we saw. Of course, the CIA kept saying that they could make this go on forever. They could keep spending the money for weapons and so forth forever. It wasn't possible.
We tried to find out what part of the Soviet economy was being invested in military activities. And I know that our results there were not always accurate.
I remember telling the Soviets that their military budget was 20% of their GNP. It turns out in retrospect that it was much higher. It was probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 40%.
I think there was an exaggeration of Soviet economic capabilities, which has to be laid at the CIA's doorstep.
The CIA did not accurately portray or analyze the dire straits in which the Soviet Union had found itself.
You could say to yourself, over the long run, they're not going to be able to support this. We saw that. We didn't see it as clearly as we could have and should have.
We sometimes overestimated the number of missiles they were going to produce.
But you can't look at 30,000 nuclear warheads and say, I don't worry about these people because their economy is going down.
I often, in my own mind, having talked to Soviets abroad during this period, I often questioned, why we thought they were such a strong power when, in fact, they were not. I think politics starts to enter into the issue. Pentagon, more weapons systems.
Sometimes our judgments about the future were inaccurate because we just didn't understand exactly where the Soviets were going.
We were running bomber missions